Because I'm going to show you the Daily Mirror and this article, which says that Labour is to pilot universal basic income scheme for everyone, rich or poor. Our guest on this is Dr. Simon Duffy. He's part of UBI, Universal Basic Income Sheffield, and the founder and director of the Centre for Welfare Reform. Welcome. Tell us what universal basic income is, first of all.
Basic income is really the idea that everybody would be guaranteed an income, individual regular payments up front, so that they can live. So everybody has a right to exist, and that this should not be taken away, or people should not be sanctioned or punished by the state, but should be guaranteed this income.
Right, we'll talk a little bit about that idea of living, existing, if you like, and where the level should be. But your area, Sheffield's been chosen by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, as a site where this idea will be tested out or piloted if Labour forms a government in the future. So you've obviously been lobbying hard. How difficult was it to persuade the Shadow Chancellor to actually take this idea on?
Well, the group, I think you slightly misnamed it, it's UBI Lab Sheffield, and the lab is important. So we're not saying we know all the answers or that this will be the perfect solution. We're saying this is a really important idea that we should be testing out, and we think Sheffield is a brilliant place to test that out. The group has existed, really, it emerged out of conversations in the city of local people talking about what's important to them. And yeah, we've been talking to Labour politicians locally and nationally for a few months. I think John McDonnell's interest in this idea and the interests of many leading thinkers has been around for some time. So it's more the coming together of two things than the direct result of our lobbying.
Katie, what do you think about this idea? Because to some extent, we have talked about this in the past, but it's always felt as if it was an idea that was perhaps on the sort of margins of political debate. Do you think it's coming into the mainstream a bit more?
No, and I think it's right not to. And I think it's one of those kind of kite-flying exercises that shows that we care about people outside of the bubble. But in reality, there's no kind of costing, how it would be paid for. You know, why should footballers and bankers receive a basic state payment? Who ends up paying for this? The taxpayer ends up paying for this. I think it's a pretty mad idea. I mean, the lab that we just saw a minute ago is a hive of activity. There's nothing going on behind it. And I think that it's one of those empty kind of ideas that won't go anywhere fast.
That's one of our BBC studios. But anyway, you may be right. But yes, go on, Simon, respond to that.
Well, I mean, that's a ludicrous response to begin with, because there have been lots of tested examples of this, and there's been actually quite effective piloting internationally of this idea. It's an idea that's also being explored for piloting in Scotland. So a lot of that, I'm not quite sure where to begin with. The reason why wealthy taxpayers like the David Beckhams should receive a basic income is it's a bit like the NHS. Everybody should receive the basic guaranteed service, and of course David Beckham et al. Will pay more tax, and there's without a doubt it is a form of redistribution, but it's a form of redistribution in the context of an economy which is broken and in the context of runaway inequality. What we're seeing is only the top. Over the last 40 years, only the top 10 to 15% of the income groups have seen their real incomes increase.
All right. I mean, let's just hang on.
What can we do?
One at a time. Now.
OK. Well, I mean, first of all, I was quite interested in this idea because it isn't just the far left that's pushing it. There are all sorts of Californian tech entrepreneurs who are saying it's the way to deal with AI. But it has been piloted. It's been trialled extensively, the most extensive trial being in Finland, which just came to an end last year. And the case is closed. It didn't work. It didn't make people apply for more jobs. It didn't mean that they had the security to go and start the next Google in their garages. I mean, of course, the people getting the money were happy to get the extra money, but it didn't have any of the impacts that the supporters of it were claiming. I have to say, the idea that the economy... I mean, we've got more people in work than ever. Every quintile has seen a rise...
There is a debate about inequality, the types of jobs and so on.
But the way in... The best route out of poverty is a secure, well-paying job, not messing around with schemes like this.
Andrew, but John McDonnell's going to be trialling it.
Yeah, we were saying earlier that one of our big problems in our political system is you can't get enough local experimentation and people doing things at local level and seeing how they work. What John McDonnell is doing, I think, is absolutely in the localist tradition. We'll have a local trial, we'll do it in 3 cities, we can then test different versions of it to see how incentives work, what the level should be, what the tax effects are, and then we can take stock. I'm very surprised that, having just come straight out of a debate about how people feel disempowered at the local level, what my colleagues on the panel are saying is, on no account should you allow any local initiative on one of the biggest and most important things affecting people, which is their basic standard of living.
I think the investment of money should be spent elsewhere. So, for example, a local pilot, when anyone can fund a local pilot, how you fund this nationally is something completely different. But also, I'm more interested in those people that are going to work every day because work should pay. We should make sure that work should pay. It is a better alternative than doing nothing. We should make sure that they are on good salaries and we're up in productivity.
We shouldn't be, but the question I think for me is that this just doesn't go far enough. Because I mean, the rate at which the universal basic income would come at, the numbers, I mean, it's pretty poor. I'm talking about people's right to exist. I want people's right to thrive, to grow, to have a better quality of life for the future. I think it's phrased in terms of is phrased in terms of very radical intervention from John McDonnell. It's not radical.
Well, that's the question. I mean, let's go back to Simon, because you were shaking your head while Dan was responding to you. Why?
Well, I mean, some of those claims are just outrageous.
Which ones?
You think about... Well, if you think about, let's take the work capability assessment, which academics have shown has led to increased mental illness and increased suicides and increased tranquilizer use. That's a recent reform to the benefit system. Unemployment is very low, but the level of income that people are receiving is also very low. The UK has pulled off the unique trick of having high employment and high inequality and low productivity. And these things are connected. You will not get a transformed economy if you actually force people into really low-paid jobs and you enable employers not to invest in the capital that will actually improve productivity. So this is a broken
somebody who lives
strategy.
on welfare in the UK now is better off than the average worker in the 1930s. If you'd asked people then about universal basic income, they'd have thought, oh, they've got it already, right? In the 21st century, what we would understand to be universal basic income from their perspective, we've already got it. And the reason that living standards continue to improve, the reason that the hours that you have to work in order to afford basic services continue to drop is because of the progress and the prosperity generated by a market economy.
Simon?
Go to a food bank and tell them that.
Well, that's an excuse for an argument. Tell that to X is what you say when you don't have
You've created
any logic.
an economy where growing numbers of people are going to food
Are you
banks.
saying that there is more poverty now? That there is more poverty on any normal metric of hours worked, of what you being able to afford footwear, clothing? Because saying there are more food banks now, I'm afraid, is not an empirical measure of poverty, as the people who founded the food banks keep saying.
Growing death rates, growing suicides. These things are well documented by the Joseph Rowntree Fund, by the Institute of Fiscal Studies. You could read all sorts of things which will explain to you why the British economy is broken and why social justice in this country
when
is
would
in
you
severe
rather have lived?
crisis.
Do you want to go back 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? When do you think we were better off than now? I'd be interested to hear when you think the golden age.
But Dan, it's not about, if it's just going to say, it's not about, we can compare, of course life is better than it is today than it was in the 1930s. Living standards have improved, but they haven't improved enough. And I mean, if you have lived on the dole, then you know what it's like. It's not a laugh. And not just because it's not enough and people are just about existing, but also because you have no scope for improving the quality of your life. We should be thinking much bigger about these things.
You've got a few seconds, Katie.
I completely agree, actually, that we should be thinking bigger and wider, and just paying people just to sit at home all day probably isn't the answer.
Thank you to Simon Duffy. That's all we've got time for. Goodbye.